with liberality. You know, it's a simple reality that we live in a world that revolves around money. There is a disparity between the poorest and the wealthiest. Even in the church, there's a disparity between the poorest and the wealthiest of us. And we need money. I mean, don't we? You got to pay the bills, you got to pay the rent, you got to pay the utilities, you got to buy food and clothing and shelter and gas, and we need money. We all have that. But the simple reality is we don't all have the same financial resources. But I happen to know of several in the congregation over the years who have benefited from the generosity of a few. Those who have means, deliberately sharing, and usually anonymously, sharing in ways. One of the ways that we used to do it was we actually had a pantry that was over at the Hardisters. And people would donate food. They would bring it to church. The Hardisters would load it up. They'd take it over to their pantry. And there were people in the church who needed that and who would go to the pantry during the week and get help, who relied on the generosity of those in the church who could afford to do it, to do it. I also know of a couple of families who told us that they had been praying, they were in desperate straits, and at the very moment they needed it, somebody in the church had brought them something they had been praying for because they could. Maybe it was a box of food, or maybe it was something else, supplies. So I know that this is a gift that God is looking for us to use with each other. That if God has been generous with us, this is the context of this. This would be the way I would frame this. If God has been generous with us, He expects us to be generous with each other, to help each other. We could walk through what happened in Acts chapter 2 and 3 and 4. Remember all of the things they did as they came together as a church, a brand new church. They sold everything and they helped each other, supported each other, loved each other. That's an extreme, but it's certainly the idea behind this. If we're going to become a unified body of Christ, we need to help each other. And those of us who've been blessed need to help those who need help. And that's what that's talking about. He goes on in verse 8, he who leads with diligence. Again, this is a gift in the church because we have things that we do we not? We have projects. We just did Northwest Weekend. You know, one of the greatest blessings that we have in Northwest Weekend is that we have wonderful project leaders. They get their area done. They need very little hand-holding. And so many of the aspects of Northwest Weekend come together because we have people that are running those different things very effectively. They know what they need, they know how to gather up the manpower, and they get it done. It's a beautiful thing. I mean, Mr. Sexton could have slept the whole weekend in his house and not missed any, and it would have run perfect, except we would have missed him at Bible study. He had an assignment. But it would have run smoothly. He came up to me Saturday morning and he said, so are we running on all cylinders? Yes. No tweaking necessary. We're doing well. One of the key characteristics, I was thinking about this on leadership. So when it comes to leaders, there are leaders and then there are leaders. You know, there's a leader who gets into a position by attrition. You know, there's just nobody left. You're the oldest one who's been here, so it's you. We're going to give you the job. That doesn't make them a leader. It just means that they get the spot. There are people who get the job because of seniority. This is common in business, for example. That you have the longest tenure, and so you'll be the one who gets the next promotion into a leadership position. Just because you're given the duty doesn't mean you have the gift. I've worked for both. I remember, I used to work in wholesale distribution. Mr. Reeves and I at the same company. He'll remember the story, though I'll keep the names out of it, except yours. So we would have to do, every year we'd have to do inventory. You're a wholesale distributor, you have material on the shelf, and the material has to be accounted for at the end of the year. And that's not fun, because we carry thousands of parts, thousands, and they have to be counted, meticulously counted and counted for. And we had a manager who was our leader, and he was a good manager. I don't think I would describe him as a good leader. So the difference here would be this. Here's the things I need you to go do. I'll be right here if you have any questions. And so we would go out and do all the hard work, and this individual would be at their desk, and they might be on the phone talking to their wife, or they might be talking to somebody else, but they're not out there in the trenches. They tell us what to go do, and the expectation is, I tell you what to do, you go do it. Okay, well, that's a manager. I wouldn't even call it a good manager in that context, but that's a manager. Managers do that kind of thing. A leader leads. We think of a leader. Have you been inspired by a movie about a manager? Do they have those movies? Who would go? Right? I mean, of all the movies that you see about real leadership, aren't they in the trenches and they're showing you the way and you're motivated and you're inspired by them and you want to help them? You'd lay down your life for them if you had to. That's a leader. That's the sign of a good leader. They inspire. Nobody watches a movie about a manager because they don't inspire. They command. They don't motivate because they command. You're supposed to be motivated by your paycheck. Well, that lasts for so long. You know, one of the biggest reasons we leave companies, it isn't because of money. Normally people leave because of poor management. They get frustrated. Not everyone's a gifted leader, but when God gives the gift of leadership, He expects that gift to be used in service to each other. Again, 12 verses 8, he says, "He who shows mercy with cheerfulness." You know, it's easy to think what is meant by mercy here is what Jesus meant in his parable described in Matthew 18. You recall that story of the master who was collecting all of the debts of his servants, and he had a servant who owed him a lot of money. And when that servant couldn't pay all of the debt, the master said, "You know what? We'll sell you, your wife, your children, and all of your goods, and we'll make good on what debt you can pay from that." And the servant falls down at the master's feet, and he begs for mercy and for patience. And out of compassion, the master forgives him that huge debt. And what did the servant go do? The servant goes out and he finds somebody who owes him a pittance. And because he couldn't pay, he throws him into jail. The extremes of what's meant by mercy. Well, we could think about that as the context of mercy, or the mercy that I might extend to you if you've done something wrong that I feel like you've wronged me, and therefore you're coming to me and you're asking for forgiveness, and therefore I'm going to extend mercy to you by forgiving you. That's not what's being talked about here. That is not what this kind of mercy is. So, in the last few days, last couple of days, last 2.5 days of my dad's life, we were at Southwest Washington Medical Center. And there are a couple of floors they reserve for end of life, and then they bring in a hospice team that works with you at the hospital. You can go to another area, but they decided to keep my dad where he was as opposed to moving him, and they brought a hospice team over to work with him. You know, the duty of the staff is to transition a patient from treatment to comfort care. So I remember I was sitting there with my dad, and I don't want to be too graphic, but when my dad, he had, his whole system shut down sort of over a period of time. And so he had liquid filling up in his lungs, his heart was very weak, his kidneys were failing, and so he just had everything was connected, and so systematically everything was failing. And at some point you have to make a decision. Dad, do you want to try to keep going? And the answer is, there's just nowhere to go from here. And so we transition. Well, there's a staff there that helps you to do that. That hospice staff. That hospice staff is an amazing group of people. I don't know that I've ever met somebody that has the heart and the soul and the willingness to do what that staff did for our family. Because for 2.5 days, 24 hours a day, somebody was with us, checking on us, making sure we had everything that we needed, making sure that my dad was truly comfortable, analyzing everything that our family was going through. Not just, how's your dad, but also talking to us one-on-one if necessary. Can we bring you someone that at one point they offered to bring a pastor in to talk to us because they truly thought we could use help, and they have an on-staff priest or a minister. He came in and talked, and I thought that was an interesting discussion between he and I. We had slightly different views on a couple things, like maybe where Dad was going after this. But that staff was an amazing staff, and I'll tell you. So my dad passed away at about 1 o'clock in the morning, and we had gone home. My mom was still there at the hospital. And we'd been working with one particular nurse more than most. She was a sweetheart. And my mom was reminding me on the way over here what happened at the very end. So at about 1 o'clock in the morning, my dad had what's classically a last gasp breath. And so he just sort of gasped, and the nurse knew exactly what that meant. And she told my mom, "Tell him you love him right now." So she did, not knowing whether he heard it or not. And we know where she's coming from, but that was her way of saying, "I've seen this before, and to comfort yourself, do this. Do it now, or you'll regret it." So Mom did. And then she called us. But before she called us, the nurse came over to her, and the two of them hugged and sobbed together. And I think, what kind of a gift is it that somebody has that they can do that? I couldn't do that. Because it's not just my dad there. And she's not dealing with just my dad that week. That's a gift. To be able to look past the pain and the suffering that a family is going through at the end of life, dealing with the end of life for a family member, to look past all of that and to see the care that's needed, and to have a heart that says, "I want to give that care." Well, that's where she was. The next day I went to collect all my dad's stuff, and she was still there, and I went up to her and I thanked her, and she gave me a big hug, and she started crying again. I started crying. Are you kidding me? I mean, I made peace with my dad's death, but that's kind of just the fact that she was that connected to us over such a short period of time and cared enough regarding the things that she did with us and what she saw us do and go through, okay? I think that's a gift. We're not all given that gift. But if we're given that gift, I know God expects us to use it. That's the mercy that's talked about. That's what's meant by this mercy. Are there other gifts that God has given that Paul does not specifically mention here? The answer is yes. I think you know that. This seems to me to be a relatively small list of gifts that God has given to us to serve each other. Another gift I know for a fact is the gift of encouragement. That's different than exhortation. The gift of encouragement. 1 Thessalonians 5:14, what does that say? First Thessalonians 5:14, "Now we exhort you, brethren, warn those who are unruly, comfort the faint-hearted, uphold the weak, be patient with all." The term comfort means to encourage or console. That's what it means. To encourage or console. You know, when Lazarus died, Martha and Mary mourned the death of their brother, right? And Mary had many come to comfort her. John chapter 11 and verse 19. John 11:19 says, "And many of the Jews had joined the women around Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother." The ability to comfort should be something we all strive to do for each other. I will tell you this, when it comes to death, I can tell you from my own experience, there's a difference when you have personally experienced death in your own family. When it has affected you personally, you begin to understand what's needed in the individual who has had that happen to them. And before that happened to me, I did not understand. You know, it's the classic case of the person who hasn't been touched, who goes up to the person who has lost a loved one and who says, "I'm sorry for you," or some careless statement that's meant to be encouraging. "I'm sorry for your loss," which is probably one of the most impersonal things that you can say to somebody who's suffered loss, because it's deeply personal. There's a lot of pain normally that's involved in all of that. And so for us to encourage, sometimes it takes real experience to be able to encourage somebody, to be able to sit there and listen to them when they tell you the suffering of something that they've gone through, and for you to be able to understand that and to be able to give them encouragement and consolation, comfort. Not everyone has that. It's not listed on my list of gifts, I can tell you that. I'm trying, okay? I'm really trying. Some people are better at that. My mom and my wife are gifted in that area. Both I would describe as gifted encouragers. They're easy to talk to. Easy for me to talk to. If I need some encouragement, they're both good at it. And I know some of you have been encouraged by them. And if you haven't, sit down and have a conversation with them and you'll be encouraged because they have a gift for that. I know others have that gift in this congregation as well. So God gives that gift of encouragement. Acts chapter 4 and verse 36. I think this is interesting because some people stand heads and shoulders above others when it comes to this gift. Acts chapter 4 and verse 36. And I know you know this name, but I've got a couple of minutes, so I thought I'd use that to just flesh this out a bit more. There's an individual that we're introduced to, but I think this goes by our heads really quickly because his real name is Joseph. Acts chapter 4 and verse 36. And Joseph, that's his name, who was also named Barnabas by the apostles, which is translated son of encouragement. So Barnabas is the nickname, son of encouragement, given to an individual whose name is Joseph. Why would you do that? Well, I would say that you probably have distinguished yourself as an encourager if the people who know you call you an encourager by name, by nickname. Let's move over to chapter 11 of Acts. I guess I relate to this idea of being nicknamed something that identifies who you are. So in my industry, in my business, so it's called IW Consulting. It's because it's Interceptor Whisperer. Now that's inside baseball for most of you, but that was a nickname I was given by colleagues in the industry who said, you know, like the movie, the Paul Redford, or the Robert Redford, was it Newman or Redford? It was Redford, because I got a picture of him. So it was a Robert Redford movie. It was called The Horse Whisperer. And there he is, sitting out in a field with the horse coming up over it. And finally, after, I don't know, weeks or whatever, him carefully working with this horse, the horse finally comes over to him and rests his head on his shoulder while Robert Redford sits there with his cowboy hat and his blue jean jacket looking all studly, where he's finally, reached the core of that horse. And then some guys took the DVD cover of the movie and they replaced the horse with a grease interceptor. And they put my picture and they morphed my face into Robert Redford. I have that framed. It's just hilarious. It's really funny. But you get what I'm saying then. So that's, for me, that's an identification that the industry said, that's you. That is you. We get it. That's you. And so in that way, Joseph was given that same nickname. Now let's look here at Acts chapter 11. That was a distraction probably, but I thought it was a funny corollary. 11 and verse 19, we'll read through 23. Now those who were scattered after the persecution that arose over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, preaching the word to no one but the Jews only. And some of them were men from Cyprus and Cyrene, who, when they had come to Antioch, spoke to the Hellenists, preaching the Lord Jesus. And the hand of the Lord was with them. And a great number believed and turned to the Lord. Then the news of these things came to the ears of the church in Jerusalem, and they sent out Barnabas to go as far as Antioch. And when he had seen the grace of God, he was glad. And what did he do? He encouraged them all that with purpose of heart they should continue with the Lord. It was Barnabas that stood by Paul and defended him in his calling. So if you want something to Bible study, go back and research that. Barnabas, the encourager, stood by Paul and defended his calling. You know who else he stood by? When Paul had not just a little bit of a problem with John Mark, he stood by John Mark to the point where Paul and him separated and went different ways over that. Now, they were reconciled later. And in fact, Paul later said to Barnabas, send me John Mark, because he has work that he can do for us. When God gives the gift of encouragement, he expects us to use it. What about foreign languages? I know Dave appreciates a foreign language called sign language. And we have a couple people here who have the gift of being able to do and to understand and interpret sign language. I have tried to do that. I was sitting in Northwest Weekend, and it was during the Bible study it was during the Friday night Bible study, and Mrs. Love was up from Eugene, and she was doing the interpreting Friday night for Mr. Sexton's Bible study, and my hand was throbbing. Just throbbing. And so the doctor said, elevate your hand if it starts to hurt, like to elevate it and get it above your heart. And so I'm doing this, and he says, always be rotating your wrist and flexing your fingers. And I'm doing this, and Deanna looks over at me. And I'm like, what? And so after the message, she comes up to me, she says, I thought you were talking to me in sign. Did it make any sense? She said, no. I'm not speaking sign language. I'm flexing my fingers. I don't have that gift, and I watch the girls when they do that, and I think they're gifted. But you know what? Mr. DeCampos was there, and he was born in Mozambique, Africa, which is Portuguese-speaking. So he was born and raised speaking Portuguese. Then he moved to South Africa, where he learned South African English. And there's a difference between South African English. You can hear it in how they say, "here." That's my favorite one. That means here, if you're not familiar with that. Here means here. And so, but that's different than Scottish English. It's different than British English. It's Australian English or even Irish English. Certainly the Scottish brogue would not count. I mean, they use words that look like English when they start out, but they don't sound English. And so we have people who have this gift of languages. Interesting if you go here to Acts chapter 2 and verse 5, just worth a touch-up on this thing because of what's interesting about this. There's that whole movement out there that believes that speaking in tongues is this weird thing that you do that's spontaneous, that's always the Spirit speaking through you, so you won't understand it. And I'm thinking, where do you get that from? Because if I read in the Scripture, let's go to Acts chapter 2 and verse 5, and we'll read through 11. Right at the very beginning, when the Holy Spirit is given to the church, and the church is established right now. And there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And when this sound occurred, the multitude came together and were confused, because everyone heard them speak in his own language or tongue. Then they were all amazed and marveled, saying to one another, "Look, are all not these who speak Galileans?" That would be like saying, are not all these people from Washougal? They speak Aramaic and German and all these languages. How can they even get out of Washougal without a permit? I don't know. I'm joking. If anybody lives in Washougal, I'm just teasing you. And now, how is it that we hear each in our own language in which we were born? What is there? 2 languages you spoke here? 2 or 3? Parthians and Medes and Elamites, those dwelling in Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, and parts of Libya adjoining Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them speaking in our own tongues the wonderful works of God. That's a lot of languages for someone to be able to speak all at the same time. So we know that this was a miracle because everyone heard whatever was being spoken in their own language. Speaking in languages is what's referred to. And that's a gift that God has given to us in this church. And what an amazing gift that is. I mean, just thinking about the deaf alone, where we have someone who's able to participate in services because someone can interpret the service for them. That's pretty awesome, right? I met somebody at the feast in France a few years ago when we went. He spoke 5 languages. Hang on, I got to count these up here. Because he spoke English. Hang on. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He spoke 5 languages fluently. He spoke English, Spanish, French, German, and Russian. Fluently. Now, those of you who have traveled to a foreign site where they speak a foreign language, you know the challenge. It's difficult to communicate. It's difficult to understand. What a blessing it is for them when you come there and you speak their language. This individual could go to the feast someplace and actually give a message in their own tongue. That's a blessing. That's a gift. Certainly that's a way in which he was able to serve the brethren by using his gift. I think it's fantastic. God has given gifts like that that unify us. And in conversation, he can bridge the gap between 2 people. I wanted to get to know this lovely elder that was over there who spoke no English at all. But he was so delightful. And after the evening meal, we would sit together in the foyer of this particular area. And what started off as 3 or 4 of us, at the end of the feast, there were 20 of us. And we would just sit there, and somebody would bring a bottle of wine from the area, and we would sip some wine, and we would laugh and tell stories. And there were those who would sit amongst us, spaced out, who were bilingual, who could help share with those who were telling a story so that we could all join in together. And it was unifying. We all felt closer together after that than before that. It was delightful. Because I got to hear the jokes, the humor, the ideas, the thoughts of somebody who doesn't speak the same language that I do. So yes, is that a gift? Absolutely, that is a gift of God. The last gift I want to mention, there are 2 more gifts I want to mention to you. Hospitality. Our church has been pretty well known over the years. God's church has been known pretty well over the years for being hospitable. You know, I remember when I was a kid, let me just back up and tell you this story because it's kind of important to me. Back in the day, for you kids, that would be like the early 1980s, late 1970s, early 1980s. Northwest Weekend's been going on, as you heard, for 54 years. So we've been around for a while. And in those days, the most common thing would be you'd have a group of people coming in from out of town, and they're just looking for the sign-up sheet. Where are we staying this weekend? It's not at a hotel. And so, but they would come in groups. For example, I was at the time living with a couple named Mike and Karen Schuster, and I was 18 or 19 years old. And Mike and Karen are on the list, and they get told that they have a group of cheerleaders coming in from Eugene, Oregon. And I'm looking at Mike going, how'd you score that? Because I'm living there. I got my own room and everything, and I'm thinking this is going to be a great deal for me. And Mike says, well, the catch is you're not staying here. That's a ripoff. So I had to go stay with Rob Slocum at his dad's house. That wasn't the same deal at all. But you know who was in that group? There's this little 16-year-old beautiful young lady named Rebecca Chambers. So there are some advantages to this idea that people would come in and stay with brethren locally where you could get together and spend time with them in a little bit more of a familiar, more intimate environment than, say, everybody staying at a hotel room someplace. So we're kind of notorious. If those of you who don't know, Rebecca is my wife. So just wanted to put a fine point on that. So she hung with me for about 4 years, and then we got married. I didn't marry her at 16, just FYI. But that was a way in which we were hospitable towards one another. I've already covered all of that. Okay. Just wanted to make sure I didn't leave anything out. The point is, I guess here's what I wanted to say about that. So look, there is a group out there of introverts that the idea of hosting, a family or hosting for a dinner even, 20 people at their house or something like that would just freak them out. Like that's just not going to happen for them, right? Hospitality really just means the ability to be, let's see if I've got the term here. I've got it defined. Hang on, let me find the definition. It just means to be friendly and welcoming to strangers or guests. That's it. We can be hospitable at church. Just being willing to go up and talk to the new person and get to know them and be hospitable to them. Be welcoming to them. That's one way. Maybe accepting an invitation to go out, you introverts. You do get invited and then you don't go. You find excuses not to go, right? So it's not that you have to host. Sometimes you can just go because you got invited. And you can be hospitable and welcoming when you've been invited. And that's really what it means. We can do that for each other in small ways or in big ways. Look, who here doesn't know the reputation of Mr. and Mrs. Sexton? They are well known for being probably the most hospitable people in the Northwest because they just don't turn people away. Mr. Sexton's complained for years when they lived in La Center that he was always taking in strays. So, and what by strays he meant boys. So he'd make them stay in the basement or something like that. But a lot of young adults would come through and they'd stay at the Sexton. Everybody knew the Sexton. And they still today are probably the most hospitable couple that I know of. And so there's a gift of hospitality. The rest of us have to work at it. Then there are those who have the gift. But here's the thing. It's the same thing. God expects us to use that gift with each other. We're supposed to become one. Hospitality is a part of that. We need to become one. 1 Peter 4 and verse 9. Because you need a scripture. You can't just take Ken's word for it. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 9. What does Peter say? He says, be hospitable one to another without grumbling. It's important. You use the second part of that with the first part. Without grumbling. So that does require some effort, especially if you're not necessarily prone towards being hospitable. It can feel like it's more burdensome to you, so you got to fight through that. Do it without grumbling. Okay, the last gift I want to mention here as we wrap up. I don't know that it's a gift, but I believe it's absolutely essential for us if we're going to be a unified body. If we're going to make this walk together, and that is to pray for each other. Look, there are some who are sick, there are some who are infirm, there are some who are simply incapable of hosting or doing a whole lot of other things that we saw listed as gifts. But we can all pray for each other. And it is absolutely essential that we do. There are some that are prayer warriors. I think we probably all met somebody who spends a lot of time praying for the brethren. They'll tell you, I've been praying for you, I've been praying for you, I've been praying for you. I'm always moved by that. Thank you. When you are doing that, thank you, because I need all the prayers I can get. Some of us have further to go on that road. James chapter 5 and verse 16. James chapter 5 and verse 16, it says, confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. What is effective, fervent prayer? So it sounds like what he's saying is that your effective prayers will be effective. But that's not what he's saying, okay? Because the word effective, fervent comes from the Greek word energio, the word from which we get energy. It means intense and fervent prayer with energy. That's what it means. Enthusiasm, intensity. You got to care. It's not just the flippant, oh, hey, by the way, something about so-and-so. You know what's wrong there. Go to it. That's not what it's talking about. This is talking about concentrating on that individual that you know needs God's help, and you with intensity, you pray for them. That's what he's talking about here. And how do we do that if we don't know what they need? And that's what James's point is. Confess your trespasses to one another. Talk to each other. It's not saying, hey, I got to tell you all about this sin that I've been dealing with, and maybe you'll pray for me. It's not about that. We have difficulties, and we've got challenges. We're in the middle of a difficult circumstance, or we need help with something, or who knows, people need help with a job or a move or a car replacement or anything that could be going on in life. If they're willing to share it, then we need to pray about it, because we can all do that for each other, and that doesn't matter whether we are the most, if we've got all the time in the world and we've got all the gifts God has given us, we still owe it to each other to pray. Or whether we are the most infirmed and can barely move, we can still pray. We can still pray for each other. But you got to know what's going on in the congregation. We need to know what people need in order to pray for them, right? That's the point. And that's what James is saying. Confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. And then he's saying the person whose focus is, this is what they do. This is what my contribution to this family is I'm going to pray for everybody. That person, when they do that with an intensity and fervency, that means something to God. It avails much. That's important for us to know. We don't have to have all the gifts of the world. We don't have to know that we have specific gifts. We may not, maybe in our lifetime, ever actually learn what we were ever given as a gift. I never figured it out. But we can still pray for each other. And there are a number of these things that we can be working towards, right? We can work towards hospitality. We can work towards encouragement. There are a number of them that we can work towards. But they were all given to us for a reason. As I mentioned at the start, beginning with Romans chapter 12, Paul shifts gears and moves from doctrines, the first 11 chapters, to the practical application within the church of God. And we learn in verse 1 that God desires that we give our lives as a living sacrifice to Him, as our reasonable and rational worship. It's not a one-day-a-week thing. It's not a 1 hour a week thing. It's an every single day, all day long thing that we do. Our whole life dedicated to that. Why? Because that is our rational worship of God. It's what He expects for us to do. That's how we worship God. He wants us to worship Him every hour of every day in all that we do. And to God, that's the only rational thing we should do. It's our living sacrifice. And that sacrifice is not done until we are dead. Because that's what a sacrifice is. And that's what the end of a sacrifice is, death. Instead of conforming to the world, God wants our worship to come from the heart by a transformation of our lives, from when He called us to where He wants us to be. And we transform our lives so that we may prove, that is, understand by application, to discern what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And it's with that foundation laid that Paul goes on to explain how. How do we do that? How do we worship God? What is the form of our reasonable service? And when we consider that we are a part of the first fruits that make up the bride of Christ, we are to become one as His bride. He doesn't want a dysfunctional bride. He doesn't want a bride that is filled with disagreement and discontent and disharmony. He wants a bride that is made ready, that is a bride of unity, that's unified in purpose, living in harmony and peace. Paul shows us that God gave us gifts to serve one another, and that God expects us to use those gifts as part of our living, ongoing, every single day sacrifice until we are dead. Or until Christ returns, which is the same thing for first fruits. These gifts are there to help us to become one. But you know, Paul isn't done there. He's not done there, because now he moves into meddling in our business. And that's what he goes into next. And so the next time I have an opportunity, we're going to go into what he brings next.